As a professor, I actually, only at the very end of a truncated career, did I teach the Israel-Palestine conflict. I used to teach Western political theory, the classics, the Socrates, the Plato, the Aristotle. I wasn't too good on the medieval period, but the early modern, the Rousseau, Mill, Marx. Those are my favorites. I loved to teach it. It was an extremely gratifying experience. And it was a real lesson for me personally, because I realized how foolish I was in my youth when I focused entirely on one tiny branch of human knowledge, because I was of the opinion that it possessed all I needed to know about how the world works, and everything else was some version of bourgeois or petty bourgeois nonsense or lies. I remember I had a friend as a youth, and his father, who was a skeptic on the paradise that was being built in China under Comrade or Chairman Mao. He would not ridicule my beliefs, but question them. And I would tell him that the only reason he entertains such doubts is because he's a petty bourgeois, and he took umbrage not at the bourgeois, but why just petty? Why couldn't he be a full-fledged bourgeois if he had to be a bourgeois? And in that period in my life, I would no doubt have found nothing more disdainful than the beliefs articulated by John Stuart Mill, if for no other reason than because he was a liberal, and in our youth there was no more contemptible label than to be called a liberal. Some of you may know the Phil Oakes song, Love Me, I'm a Liberal. And that was our credo as people of the left, that liberals were kind of lacking in a robustness of thought and conviction. They were a weak version of what we aspired to be. They wanted to reform the state. We, of course, wanted to smash the state. And they believed in nonviolence, and we believed that, as Chairman Mao put it, political power grows out of the barrel of a gun, and so on and so forth. I won't bore you with the litany, and it depresses me just as I recite it, because there was a whole lot of foolishness and squandered years, I have to concede. But nothing was as bad, I would have to say, as the humiliation. The reason people who are really have deep political conviction, one of the reasons they're so immune to criticism, it's not just a question of ego. It's a question, when you have deep conviction, your whole person is invested in your ideas. And when you're shown to be wrong, it's so humiliating to think back to the certitudes of my youth, and now to realize all the time when I was calling him a bourgeois, and she a petty bourgeois, and he a bourgeois, and then to realize, well, you know what? They were right, and I was wrong. And it's a very hard thing to have to admit Because it's not just an isolated idea in your mind. It's your whole being when you're a political person. It's your whole being that's at stake. And when some truths come crashing in, it's not just so easy to get up in the morning and resume as if nothing happened. There are a couple of people in the room. One of the women is not here right now, but in my day, I was a Maoist, follower of Chairman Mao, and I studied under the most renowned professor of that persuasion. His name was Charles Bettelheim in Paris. And when Mao passed from the scene and then his so-called followers, the Gang of Four, were overthrown in China, Bettelheim was hospitalized for like 3 weeks. And I actually was bedridden for a long period also. But the bedriddenness was not because I was physically ill. It was I didn't want to face people. I was so wrong in my beliefs. And Mill came along at the right point in my life because I was ready now to hear what he had to say. I was a person whose certitudes had been shattered, and I was ready to hear somebody say, don't be so certain that what you think is true is true. Don't be so certain, and don't silence those with whom you disagree, because for all you know, they may be wrong. Excuse me, for all you know, they may be right, and you might be wrong. And as I said, he came along at the right point in my life. If I had read him in college, I would have dismissed it as bourgeois twaddle. But I read it after that very sorry experience, and so I was ready for it. And when I was ready for it, I was ready to take it with me throughout life. There's a passage in Mill, which I hope we'll get to today, where he says, the great advantage of truth is this. Maybe I'll just read it right now to begin the class. 1 second. It's a very stirring passage. Let's see. Here we go. So I'm going to ask Ben, would you mind coming up here? We'll move the chair here. And I would just give you the key word, because Mill is one of those great stylists of the 19th century who has terrifying control over the English language. It's a kind of breathtaking sight to behold. And the way he puts something is as moving as the content. So I like to do Mill. Usually you would have to have a copy of him in front of you, but I know that that's an unreasonable standard, judging by my lunch. We should be lucky there is a floor and a ceiling in this room.
I knew you mentioned the lunch.
You can always judge a culture by its hospitality. Latin Americans like to say mi casa es su casa. I said, speaking as a Jew, it's a perfect match because we say su casa es mi casa. And today I had a taste, so to speak, a taste of British communist hospitality. Four lettuce leaves and a piece of carrot. Four. Right. And I want you all to bear in mind that this is all preceded by Ben's wife whispering to us out of earshot of all the other comrades, that she had prepared a special lunch for me. And I took special to mean like the nomenclatura lunch. Now I understood that being a guest, it was negative nomenclatura. So far be it from me to expect that you would have copies of Mill with you. By the way, I found in retrospect that Karl Marx was wholly unfair to Mill. For those of you who've read Das Kapital, and I hope everyone here has read it at least 3 times, as I have, he has a moment of supreme ridicule directed against Mill, and it was very clever what he wrote, but it was totally off base, in my opinion. Mill was a very smart guy. And to dismiss him, it's just wrong. And it bothers in retrospect. It makes you wonder about his judgment. Okay, so that passage I was going to have him, let's just get it. Give me a half moment. I have it right in front of me. Here, just enter dictum. Yeah. Who has a good speaking voice?
Good. Yeah.
You're fine. Who has a good speaking voice? Because mine is not what you would call first class. Good.
Yeah, but indeed, the dictum that truth always triumphs over persecution is one of those pleasant falsehoods which men, brackets, and women.
We asked for your speaking voice, not for your editorial qualities.
Repeat after one another till they pass into commonplaces but which all experience refutes. History teems with instances of truth put down by persecution. Not suppressed forever, it may be thrown back to centuries.
Now skip a little, go down. All right, keep going, I'll get to you. It is a piece. Yeah.
It is a piece of idle sentimentality that truth, merely as truth, has any inherent power, denies to error of prevailing against the dungeon and mistake. Men are not more zealous for truth than they often are for error, and the sufficient application of legal or even of social penalties will generally succeed in stopping propagation of error.
So far, Mill is saying that there are people who are as fanatical in their wrong beliefs as there are people who are fanatical in their right beliefs. And there's no reason to suppose that truth, merely as truth, has any advantage over falsehood. That he says, if you articulate a false belief and you have the law behind you, or you have the dungeon and the stake, a jail cell and capital punishment behind you, falsehood could as easily prevail as truth might prevail. So then, what is the advantage of truth? And here he says,
the real advantage which truth has consists in this, that when an opinion is true, it may be extinguished once, twice, or many times. But in the course of ages, there will generally be found persons to rediscover it until someone of its reappearances falls on a time when from favourable circumstances it escapes persecution until it has made such head as to withstand all subsequent attempts to suppress it.
okay, just go back to the top. I'm just going to read it one more time because it takes a little time for Mill to sink in. So just let me go. But indeed, the dictum that truth always triumphs over persecution is one of those pleasant falsehoods which men repeat after one another till they pass into commonplaces, but which all experience refutes. It's just not true that truth triumphs over persecution. History teems. History is filled with instances of truth put down by persecution. For example, Finkelstein being denied tenure. If she can editorialize, put down by persecution. If not suppressed forever, it may be thrown back for centuries, which is a quite nice image, the idea of being thrown back, the truth, historical progress being retarded by centuries because the truth has been suppressed. Go ahead. It is a piece of idle sentimentality. Just read down. Yeah, go down. Yeah, I'll do it. It is a piece of idle sentimentality that truth, merely as truth, as any inherent power denied to ever, of prevailing against the dungeon and the stake. Men are not more zealous for truth than they often are for error, and a sufficient application of legal or even social penalties will generally succeed in stopping the propagation of either. The real advantage which truth has consists in this, that when an opinion is true, it can be extinguished once, it can be stopped twice, it can be stopped dead in its tracks many times. But if something is true, in the course of ages, there will generally be found persons to rediscover it, until some one of its reappearances falls on a time when from favorable circumstances it escapes persecution until it has made such headway as to withstand all subsequent attempts to suppress it. Basically, I think what he's saying there is, you take the example of slavery. From ancient times, from the time of Spartacus, there have been those who said slavery is wrong. And there were periodically in the course of human history slave uprisings under the principle that slavery is wrong. And they were constantly put down, suppressed, suppressed, suppressed. Along comes the 19th century, and for reasons which I don't think have been adequately explained, slavery is rapidly abolished in the course of the century. When we talk about slavery, we're talking about chattel slavery, property, ownership of a human being as a piece of property. And the point Mill is saying is, once it was abolished, the abolition came at a time when it then becomes part of the permanent cultural acquisition of humanity. It can be reversed. If you use your imagination and you ask yourself, in the most morbid scenario that you can conjure in your mind of a future, sort of what you might call the maximum dystopia. Even, I would say, in the maximum dystopia that you can conjure in your mind, it's inconceivable that slavery in human property will ever be reenacted. As Mill says, until some one of its reappearances, in this case, the wrongness of slavery, falls on a time when favorable circumstances, from those favorable circumstances, it escapes persecution until it has made such headway as to withstand all subsequent attempts. It's become a permanent acquisition of humanity. That's what slavery was in the 19th century. Who would want to suggest what is the analog in the 20th century? If the 19th century was the epoch in which the notion of slavery in property was completely abolished, human property, what was the 20th century? I think there is an analog.
Wage slavery.
What?
Wage slavery.
I can't hear.
Wage slavery.
No, it's still with us. We're in the 21st century. What was the acquisition in the 20th century?
Say wages.
Yes, I think the equality, 19th century was the equality of humankind. 20th century was the equality of women and men. It's inconceivable, again, in the most morbid dystopia of the future. You can imagine women being denied the right to vote. It just can't happen. Look, there are, I don't want to use the cliche exceptions to the rule. I'm talking about a kind of cultural zeitgeist. Everybody recognizes Saudi Arabia is operating in another century. And that's actually literally the case. They're operating in another century. You can't imagine by the end of the 20th century that the right to vote, which was a hard right to win at the beginning of the 20th century, you can't imagine that ever being reversed. That's over, I think. That battle has been won. And I think it's an interesting question. What is the next battle? If the 19th century was... I also wanted to mention before I get to that, it is an interesting fact that Mill's other great social work was On Liberty, and how many of you have read his great, The Subjection of Women? Yeah, it's a great piece, a great essay, and he compares the condition of women to slavery, and he predicts that this is the next movement, well, he's fighting at that point for the equality of women. So it's an interesting fact that he was on the mark as to what was coming next. Namely, once we've fought the battle against slavery in human beings, the next battle is to end the slavery of women. Or as he called it, subjection, but he also compared it to slavery. Who wants to hazard a guess as to what's the next great battle in the 21st century?
I'll go along with the one thing about wage slavery.
I think wage slavery is obviously a candidate. The reason I recoil a little bit from wage slavery, because wage slavery, and I fully admit this to being a prejudice, it feels more like a subclass than a world historic change. But I understand if you're a communist, yes, you would consider the abolition of wage slavery another achievement along the order of about abolishing slavery. Yes, there's an argument there. I happen to think, but it's a personal prejudice, I think the next great battle is the equality of sentient life. That just as when we look back now, we look at cannibalism as a form of barbarian behavior, I would say probably in 100, 200 years, the notion of eating an animal, sentient life, will rank at the same level of barbarism that we now hold cannibalism. As I was saying to somebody the other day I met here, he said he could never give up on lamb. He's Iranian. And I said, you know, we have a little nursery rhyme. Mary had a little lamb. Its fleece was white as snow. Everywhere that Mary went, her lamb wanted to go. How's it go? Was sure to go. I said, well, what would you think if there was another line in that rhyme and then Mary ate her lamb? There's something wrong there, right? Anybody who has any argument against me on this, the answer seems to me very simple. Anybody here have a pet, a dog or a cat? Raise your hand. Raise your hand. Do you love your dog? Never ask a commonsensical question to an audience of communists. It's just a waste of time. Who loves their dog?
We all love Phil, so.
I'm going to drop that argument because your answers are akin to your notion of meals. Okay. Well, let me now turn, what I would like to devote our time this afternoon to is just one part of Mills on Liberty. Mills on Liberty is divided into basically two parts. Chapter 3 is on liberty of speech, and then chapters 4 and 5 are on liberty of conduct. What you should or shouldn't be allowed to say, and then what you should and shouldn't be allowed to do. Obviously, those fall into quite discrete, though not always distinguishable categories. It's a different order of things. If this young man stands by the door and hands out a leaflet saying, "Long live nudity," and if he comes to class naked, we can all agree it poses different questions. The first question is a fairly straightforward one of liberty of speech. The second poses all sorts of problems, I think. But I think we can recognize it poses different kinds of questions. And Mill, on the question of liberty of speech, you can say, using American language, he's a kind of First Amendment fundamentalist. Everything goes. He has one limit he puts in, which I won't discuss right now because it's just not all that important. The big picture is he's pretty much anything goes when it comes to liberty of speech. There shouldn't be any limits or constraints put on it. The important point for our purposes to begin with is Mill does not argue in favor of freedom of speech on the basis of what you might call a natural rights argument. He doesn't make an argument like, it is my, so to speak, God-given right to speak my mind. Nobody has the right to curb my thoughts. It is one of my inalienable rights, the right to speak. He doesn't speak to speak my mind. He doesn't make that kind of argument. Mill was of the utilitarian school, namely, you had to show why a right was useful. And so the burden of Mill's argument is to show why we are all beneficiaries. Why do we all gain by allowing every opinion to be expressed or articulated? How do we gain by it? If you can't show a net gain, and in fact for Mill, it's more than a net gain, it's a total gain. There are no losses when it comes to free speech. It's a total gain. If you can't show why it's useful, then it's not part of his argument. He's just not interested in that kind of argument, the natural rights argument. He wants to make a utilitarian argument that it is useful for all of us to allow for an unrestrained, unconstrained, untrammeled expression of each of our opinions. I'll just enter one caveat. Caveat is the fancy word for exception. Not exception, I would call it just a caution. Mill is kind of the old school of thought. I'm not going to say it's right or wrong. I'm just going to articulate his mindset. He's of the mindset that sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never harm me. He doesn't believe in the notion, which has become a kind of commonplace of current culture, that hurling epithets or making statements which you might find personally offensive, he does not accept that that is a harm. Harm consists in some form of physical or violent blow, but it can't consist merely, and I put merely in quotes because some people might take offense at the merely, it cannot consist merely in what we now would call psychological damage. We might call it emotional damage. He does not accept those forms of damage as constituting damage or harm. The only harm or damage he's willing to accept is some kind of physical blow. Whether he's right or wrong, I think it's a complicated question. However, as we go along, I will try to show that using the argument of emotional and psychological damage, it inevitably and invariably produces a sterile intellectual culture. Because there's always going to be someone or someones who take offense, personal offense, at any idea to which they find wrong or personally offensive. And it ends up, I think, we call it in the United States, and I suspect you call it here also, political correctness. It produces a kind of political correctness which is stifling to any kind of debate, any kind of vigorous intellectual debate. The problem with the politically correct people, in my opinion, is they don't apply that rule, which I mentioned that has to be applied across the board. Namely, if you want to use this principle of causing emotional and psychological harm, then you have to take into account our emotional and psychological harm. If you're going to say that we have the right to speak about abortion because women should have the right to choose, well, can't a Christian have the right of veto, a devout Christian, on the grounds that they think that's the equivalent of infanticide? It's murdering children. That is a deeply felt belief. If we have the right to suspend speech which hurts the feelings of others, then shouldn't we have the right to then suspend any discussion of abortion, which for a deeply believing Christian is an offensive, a deeply offensive idea. It's infanticide, or a version of infanticide. I, in my adult life, was constantly confronted with the fact, because I spoke to mostly Jewish universities in New York, that what I had to say about Israel, the Jewish students found deeply, even mortally offensive? Was that a legitimate grounds for suspending my right to express my opinion? If you're using the standard of emotional and psychological damage, and you use that standard not selectively, but you use it across the board, I think it's then true I shouldn't have had that right. The problem is politically correct people, mostly liberals and leftists, they think you have the right to offend others because their beliefs are backward. But they can't attack you because your beliefs are progressive. But once you start using the standard across the board, you're going to quickly discover that you can't say anything either. And that's why I don't think the problem with Mill is only that he's kind of old-fashioned. The sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never harm me. I don't think it was just that he was old-fashioned. Well, maybe there is an element of that. I think he understood the very real problem when you start using emotional and psychological harm as a grounds for silencing opinion. Once you use that category, it's over. It's over. Because you can end up offending anyone about anything. So I think it's a problematic issue. It's much more complicated, and I think people who are the politically correct persuasion are willing to acknowledge. So the first caveat is, as I said, when Mill discusses liberty of speech, the premise is the only harm he accepts from speech is physical harm. Otherwise, the only harm he accepts as a category is physical harm. He does not accept verbal, as we call it now, verbal abuse as a form of abuse or harm. The second caveat is that Mill has his own assumption. There's one assumption underlying the whole essay, or at least the parts devoted to liberty of speech. And the assumption is truth is an ultimate value. That wanting to know truth is an ultimate value. Or as he puts it, just enter best of men. I know, and women. Let's not get carried away with the political correctness. He did his best. He was in the 19th century. He loved his wife, who was, according to him, who was smarter than him, Harriet Taylor, with whom he had an illicit affair. Best of men. Try entering men.
Yeah, it's going to be long. Yeah, it's going to be
What's the matter? No, best of men.
Yeah, the best of men didn't bring anything. Yeah.
That's impossible.
What's the message?
Okay, try really useful. Okay.
Yeah.
In the opinion, not of bad men, but of the best of men, no belief which is contrary to truth can be really useful. If something is not true, it doesn't have any real use. And contrary-wise, if it's true, it's useful. And so, as I said, Mill is going to use the standard of utility. Namely, he's going to try to prove that freedom of speech is useful. And the premise of the whole argument is there is no value in lies, and that there's something springing from the essential nature of who we are as human beings, that we all ultimately strive to know truth, and whatever the consequences, however painful, you all know the expression, truth is a bitter pill to swallow. However painful it might be, you still, because it's the nature of who we are as human beings, communists accepted, you want to know truth. So, can we go along with that? I'm afraid to ask this question because I could see already where we were going with the dog haters. Can we all agree that, painful as it may be, your significant other is at this very moment, as you're sitting in front of the seat, sitting in the front row, is having an affair? It's painful. That's painful for the dog. You would want to know. Can you agree to that? If your significant other is having an affair with multiple members of the Olympic team, you would want to know. Yes. So, not necessarily. What? Well, Mill would not accept that. And I don't think most people, in fact, I don't think all people, in their best moments, believe that either. There is something in our being that longs and yearns and wants to know the truth, painful as it often is. And so knowing the truth for Mill is useful. And then that presents the basic question. How do you know truth? What are the prerequisites for any authentic search for truth? That is the essence of that chapter On Liberty, on speech. What is the prerequisite for knowing, or prerequisites for knowing truth? And the way we're going to test his proposition is by posing a hypothetical. And the hypothetical is simple, straightforward, easily assimilated. The hypothetical is this. We are currently occupying a room at Westminster College. Am I correct? Yeah. Okay. And let us say there are 3 faculty members at Westminster College. One in the Department of History. The professor, let's call him Ben Lewis. Professor Lewis teaches modern Europe. That's his specialty. That's his area of expertise. He was hired to teach the introductory course in modern European history. And the course is mandatory. It's not what we call in the US, I'm not sure if you use it here, it's not an elective. It's a required course. Every incoming freshman student has to take the course. It's also a lecture class, which is to say, it's a large room, several hundred students. In order to get through the coursework, there's no time to field questions. It is just lecture. 300 students in the lecture class, mandatory. no options, and he wants to devote one class of one course, one class in this course on modern European history. He wants to devote one class to the topic, the Nazi Holocaust never happened. He wants to teach one class of the course, mandatory, no questions, lecture course. There's a professor in the anthropology class, anthropology department. The professor teaches comparative cultures. It is also a mandatory class, required course, also lecture course. The professor wants to teach one class of that course in comparative cultures to the proposition that in some cultures, women like to be beaten and raped. In some cultures, women like to be beaten and raped. And then there's a third professor in the genetics department. The professor teaches heredity, genetics. And the professor wants to teach one class of this introductory course on genetics. He wants to teach the proposition that intelligence is racially hereditary and that white people are intellectually superior by virtue of heredity to non-white people. Those are the three professors. Those are the conditions set. Required course, no questions, just listen, and should they have the right to teach those courses? Let me just reword that. Should they have the right to teach one class of those courses on those three subject matters?
Maybe teaching the truth, whatever.
Before we get into it, let's just do by a show of hands. Think it through. On reflection, how many people would say they should have the right to teach those courses? Raise your hand.
Do you have the right to protest outside? Then yes.
Well, of course you have the right to protest outside. There's no issue there. If you think they shouldn't have the right, and don't be afraid, they shouldn't have the right. Excuse me?
Do you mean the legal right to do something the university should allow?
Well, I would say the question could easily be cast as, should the university allow them to teach those classes? Yeah, that's fine. Doesn't change for me the essence of the question. So raise your hand if you think they shouldn't have the right. Don't be afraid. You should not.
Except for my course.
Okay. Raise your hand. Hi. Okay. Let's start. You can have a boycott, but the issue is, does the boycott reach the point of denying the professor the right to teach? Excuse me? Okay, let's start with the objections. That falls in the category of objections. So, one by one, we're going to try to go through the objections, and we're going to try to see how Mill attempts to meet the objections, and then decide whether he prevails in the argument. So, if you want to make the argument against Mill, I'll begin with your reservation, not so much a reservation, it's a query. He says, are they going to use facts? And the answer obviously is, it is a university which has a distinctive quality from public discourse in general. And yes, he or she has to make recourse to arguments that are considered legitimate in a university environment, which is to say there has to be evidence, there has to be fact, there has to be logic and reason to link the facts and the evidence. Otherwise, it's perfectly legitimate in my mind to count the person out. So that to me is, again, it's a kind of non-starter. Of course we agree on that. It's a university, but the three professors are convinced that they can pass muster on the issue of fact and logic, and they're going to give their lecture with fact and logic in their arsenal to try to persuade. So,
asserting as, not do they use facts in support of the proposition, but do they assert what they're saying as fact?
yes, I would say it's hard to make the distinction because obviously if you're convinced of your argument, you think it's that. That's, unless you're a charlatan, but let's, for argument's sake, assume they really believe what they're saying.
Well, it's also, you can select facts out of many facts. How do you select them, what conclusions you draw from them? And that's the point. You can actually select facts out from the holocaust to show there was no holocaust. If you want, the fact that somebody survived.
Well, let's start with point A. You're making the assumption in your argument that the side with which you disagree, they are being selective in their use of fact, whereas you are not being selective. Now, on what basis do you make that assumption? There can only be one basis for your assumption. That you are confident that you possess truth and that the other person is wrong. The other person is being selective. I am not being selective. So the premise of your argument is the other person must be in some way being dishonest or disingenuous in his or her use of fact, whereas I am being honest. But how do you know that? How can you have any certainty that your opinion is right? There is only one possibility of your certainty. There is only one possibility that you can be certain. And that possibility is that you are God. The moment you acknowledge your fallibility as a human being, part of the baggage that comes with your fallibility is the possibility. The possibility. I'm not saying the certainty. The possibility that you're wrong. That you're the one that's being selective. And the other person is the one who's using evidence properly. And by not allowing that professor to speak, it's not only that you are not yourself being exposed to the truth, but you're denying everyone else that possibility. Because you're not letting them hear. You're not letting them hear an argument which you cannot be certain is false. And so Mill writes, just do infallible. No?
Mankind not infallible.
Okay, just, you'll have to do just a couple of words. Desire to suppress. Okay. Those who desire to suppress an opinion, of course, deny its truth. But for those of you who raised your hand, they are not infallible. They have no authority to decide the question for all mankind and exclude every other person from the means of judging. And then he says, all silencing of discussion. Each of you who raised your hand and said that they shouldn't be allowed to speak, all silencing of discussion is an assumption of infallibility.
It's not a discussion.
Wait. Okay. Wait. I'm perfectly happy to entertain and to argue with you. I hear some mumbling here about there not being a discussion. I did say it's true. There will be no questions taken. So you take objection to that. Now, I have a simple question for you. Very simple. You're driving in a car. You have some right-wing person espousing the most wretched ideas. If you are a rational person, bear in mind you can't answer the car radio. Correct? You can't answer the television set. And God only knows you can't answer the innumerable number of authors of books who are dead. You can't answer them. Now, what does the rational person do? Does the rational person, the moment he hears or she hears an idea that they don't find appealing, do you turn the dial on the radio? Do you turn off the television? Do you throw away the book? Is that rational? 1 second. You may say sometimes, but in your better moments, you realize that if I'm interested in truth, I should be listening. I may not like it, but if I'm seriously interested in truth, I should be listening. You don't switch the dial, you don't turn off the television, and you don't burn the book. You may not like it, but rational people listen.
You specify that it's a compulsory course.
Yes.
So that you're making your setup is not whether the faculty member has the right to speak on it, but whether the faculty member has the right to enforce the students to listen.
Okay. The question would be, okay, I'm listening to every word. I am. The problem again with your argument is the unstated, the tacit premise, which in my opinion is wrong-headed for the following reason. If the person, it turns out what he or she was saying were true, it was a minority opinion, but as it turns out, it was true. Would you find it objectionable that it was a mandatory class?
Yes.
Why would it be objectionable? He is or she is exposing you to the truth. You find it objectionable because you're assuming it's false. Of course. Why would you object to truth? Why would you object to a mandatory class that tells you the truth? Does that make any sense? Is there any rational person on planet Earth that would object to attending a class where the professor is telling the truth? That's crazy. The reason you object to it is it's because you think it's false. But the only reason you can think it's false is because you think you're God. Communist Party of Great Britain, God. Otherwise, why would you object? Yes.
Okay, right, I'll give you one. The reason I object to someone giving a lecture on why political joy is raised with violence is not because it's false, because I'm infallible, but because the purpose of such a lecture is to legitimise violence against the woman in the future, and that directly contradicts what Mill says. You say it inflicts violence on a personal dignity. That's why it's wrong.
But you have a fundamental problem here.
Some heckling from this side, please. You said,
Allow me,
you said, Conrad, that there was one exception to John Stuart Mill's thing about anything goes, and that was the mill owner that was someone outside the mill inciting people effectively to violence against that mill owner. So in some examples here, I think people may be feeling some type of speech effectively do that.
No, that's a total misrepresentation of Mill. I'm serious. We can laugh or we can joke, but there are also serious issues at stake. And I want to just take them in sequence. Your point, you say it may do X and Y in the future. Let's say, but you see, you're making again the assumption that it's not true.
No, that's not.
What happens? Here is the question. What happens if it's true? We started out with the argument that nothing which is contrary to truth is useful. Now, what if it's true? You want to now put limits on truth.
No, I'm not.
You're going to say, if the truth causes a harm, then we shouldn't know the truth. We are in a classroom and we are learning. And you can't, in a classroom, start putting limits on truth on the grounds it may cause harm in the future or even tomorrow. When you start doing that, we have ceased searching for truth. You're doing something else. You're doing something else, but you're not searching for truth. Now, the argument that Mill makes is
specify that this truth may not be challenged. So you're arguing for the right of institutions to enforce the version of people without that these people enjoy the right to be challenged. This is beyond the rules and beyond the
no, because it's one class. We live in a society where we're constantly bombarded with rape is terrible. The Holocaust was the worst horror in human history. Racism, intelligence being inherited by genetics is horrible. You hear that all the time. So now you have one class of one course, and you're reacting like something is being horrifically imposed upon you. It's one peep of dissent amidst a chorus of grand Russian-style choir of political correctness. We're talking about one class, and you're already bridling at the idea how horrible it is, how I'm feeling oppressed. It's one class hearing a different point of view.
What is a compulsory class with no right to reply or challenge? That's the point.
You have, Conrad, you have your mind. You can challenge whenever you like. Nobody's forcing you to believe anything. It's simply getting you to think. You then leave class. If you feel strongly about it, you go and research. You go and ask. You go and talk. Nobody's hurting you. The only memorable class I had in college in 4 years, the only memorable class I had in 4 years in college was Morris Zlotnick. He taught Marxism. He was all the way on the far right. He was a brilliant man, marvelously eloquent, and very persuasive. And each day I sat in the class so deeply shattered and crushed. And the first thing I did after class is I ran to the student union to talk with their elder comrades about why he's wrong. It didn't stop me from thinking. It incited me to think. In fact, 40 years later, it's the only class I remember. But it's true, because everybody else was speaking the politically correct party line, which leaves no imprint on the mind. So the idea that he's suppressing you is, as a factual matter, the exact opposite. He stimulates you to rethink your assumptions and beliefs, and to help you, as Mill will say later in a moment, help you to find truth. He helps you to find truth. Now, we are all fallible creatures. We are all capable of error. And then the basic question is, well then, if we're fallible creatures, capable of error, what's the only way a rational person, a human being, what's the only way that you can know truth? There's only one way. It's not complicated. Every child knows it. Every 6-year-old knows it.
Practice. Verbalize it.
There's only one way. This man, he's 6 years old. He's in the park with his friend. And he says, the world is round. His friend says to him, no, you're wrong. The world is flat. And then he turns to her and he says, I'm wrong. What's the next word he says?
Why?
Or prove me wrong. The only way a rational person, a human being, a flawed human being can know truth is to invite those who contest your truth, to invite those who contest your truth to prove you wrong. That's the only way. If he said, prove me wrong, and when she tries to prove him wrong, he goes like this. Ah! Would you call that a rational response? It could be. Communist Party, Great Britain, could be. 40 years of teaching, first time I heard that. No. And isn't it the equivalent? Isn't it the equivalent to the person who shuts his ears and goes, to say you're not letting the people speak? If you want to know the truth, as Mill says, you have to make a standing invitation to the world to prove you wrong. Complete liberty of contradicting. Let's see.
Depends on your class here as well. Right.
Complete liberty of contradicting. And then we're going to get to that. Yes, we're going to get to that.
They're all having it on the
Okay. No. Yes, here it is. So Mill writes, complete liberty. Would you like to read it for us, someone?
Complete liberty of contradicting and disproving our opinion is the very condition which justifies us in assuming its truth for purposes of action, and on no other terms can a being with human faculties have any rational assurance of being right.
The only basis for your conviction that you're right, the only basis is inviting everybody else to prove you wrong. If you silence anybody, you have no basis for believing that what you think is true actually is true. That's one of the limitations of being human. You have to hear everybody out if you're interested in knowing the truth. Just the one you have most worried. The beliefs. Somebody else? Read it. Anyone? Yes?
The beliefs which we have most worried for have no safeguard to rest upon, but a standing invitation for the whole world to prove them unfounded.
The only way you can have a deep conviction in anything is if you've allowed everybody who disagrees with you to express his or her dispute with your opinion. Otherwise, you can't know. Now, some people might say this is a kind of relativism. Isn't Mill just saying that you can't know truth, or in a kind of stupid parlance of current culture, left culture, talking about isn't every opinion a narrative? One of the dumber expressions to come along in a dumb culture. No, Mill's not saying that. What Mill is saying is, and I think this is an important part of his argument, read from, try the fallacy of what was fallacious. The fallacy. Okay. He says, you can never be certain of truth. You can. Your deepest conviction today, you might discover tomorrow, is wrong. It's just happens. You can't be certain. But what you can do as a human being is you can make the best faith effort to know truth, which is something different. You make the best faith effort, which means you hear everybody out. If you feel confident that you can answer all the arguments against your point of view, you've made the best faith effort. Does that mean you possess truth? No, it doesn't. Because a new argument can come along tomorrow, and it'll prove the arguments. It'll prove that your argument is still wrong. It's still time limited, your truth. But what you can do is make the best faith effort. So Mill writes, in the case of any person, yeah, you have it.
I do.
Yeah. Just skip up. Move it. Yeah. In the case of any person, who would like to read it?
Yeah, so.
Yeah, who would like to read it? You?
Me, no. I can't see it. I'm going back.
Oh, okay.
In the case of any person whose judgment is really deserving of confidence, how has it become so?
The question is, why would we respect one person's judgment over another? Why does one person deserve deference to his or her judgment as against another person whose judgment we don't respect? What is the criterion? And Mill says the criterion is quite simple. Go ahead.
Because he has kept his mind open to criticism of his opinions and conduct. Because it has been his practice to listen to all that could be said against him, to profit by as much as was just, and to expound to himself and upon occasion to others the fallacy of what was fallacious.
Go ahead.
Because he has felt that the only way in which a human being can make some approach to knowing the whole of the subject is by hearing what can be said about it by persons of every variety of opinion, and studying all modes in which it can be looked at by every character of mind. No wise man has ever acquired his wisdom in any mode but this, nor is it in the nature of human intellect to become wise in any other manner.
Go ahead.
Yeah. The steady habit of correcting and completing.
Oh, no, that's it. I just checked my notes. Let me read that again. I think it's a quite eloquent passage, worth trying to internalize, very difficult to practice. In the case of any person whose judgment is really deserving of confidence, how has it become so? Why do we trust somebody's judgment? Because he has kept his mind open to criticism of his opinions and to criticism of his conduct. Because it has been his practice to listen to all that could be said against him. Just to listen. You don't always have to talk. Yes, it's mandatory. Yes, there are no questions. But who cares? The important thing is it's facilitating your appropriation of truth. Because you're listening to every opinion that could be said against your own. To profit by as much of it as was just, and expound to himself and upon occasion to others the fallacy of what was fallacious, to gain the truths that might be buried there, and also, of course, to show where that person or persons is wrong. Because this person has felt that the only way in which a human being can make some approach to knowing the whole of a subject is by hearing what can be said about it by persons of every variety of opinion. A misogynist, a Holocaust denier, a racist. Every variety of opinion. He doesn't put limits. He doesn't put constraints. Every variety of opinion, and studying all modes in which it can be looked at by every character of mind. For those who raised your hand, saying they shouldn't have the right to speak, no wise man ever acquired his wisdom in any mode but this, nor is it in the nature of human intellect to become wise in any other manner. Got to hear every variety of opinion, and you've got to listen. He doesn't say anything up there about your right to talk, your obligation to listen if you're truly committed to truth. Yes?
I wanted to ask about someone who is Charlotte, who is an outright liar. You mentioned that there's some separate rules there. And then, of course, you've got those people who are kind of in a bit of an in-between position. I mean, for example, in your own case, for example, if someone writes a book and it doesn't make sense, there's a lot of falsehoods in there, then they've got every right to do that. There's nothing wrong with it. And if they happen to have a lot of battle and push that opinion forward, then that's a perfect expression for your speech.
I follow you, but I'm not sure I get to, so to speak, the punchline. What's the argument that you're making?
The argument is that they have every right to do that under the banner of freedom of speech. And they can propagandize a bunch of lies.
That's correct. Again, I have to say that using Mill's standard for knowing truth, you can't know it's a lie a priori. You have to first either read or listen. But you can't preemptively say that the person is not telling the truth, therefore I don't want to listen. How could you know it's not true until you have listened? So let me give you an example from Mill. He says two things. Number one, you have to make a distinction between the truth and knowing the truth. The truth is not the same as knowing the truth. As a human being, you want to know the truth. Now, what is the distinction? The distinction, it may sound a little bit like a word game, but actually it's not. So I don't have at my disposal a blackboard, but with all due respect for your scenic posters, we'll do a simple thing. It's it's great. Okay, that's what I mean. So let's take a simple grade school example, which will be familiar to all of you. You're in 4th grade, you're learning square roots. And the question is the square root of 4. And the choices are 0, 1, 2, and 3.
Racist.
Where are you going? Racist?
Yeah.
Inside joke. And you, the night before, hadn't done your homework, too busy on the social media, Twittering and Facebooking and whatever else. In other words, just another imbecile. And your homework, and as any child will at this moment, he or she puts their faith and hope in the Almighty, closes his or her eyes, and enters in this. Lo and behold, he got the right answer. He got the truth. The square root of 4 is 2. Now, the question is, the question is, does he know the truth about the square root of 4? No. The answer is true. He knows the truth. I mean, he got the true answer. But he doesn't know the truth. Because truth is more than the answer. It's also the process. How you got to the truth. Truth is more than just the correct answer. Now, let's ask our friend Tony, who is resistant to all these bourgeois and petty bourgeois ideas. What is the only way a rational person can know truth?
It's through experience, but it's also sometimes collective common knowledge. There are some things which are established truths. Sometimes the truth is relative.
No.
Yes.
No, these kinds of ideas, I rule, these kinds of ideas, they are out of bounds. Because, I will tell you, I know that kind of argument. I know it because I lived it. I am not a young person anymore. And I had the good fortune of living through epochal changes in our attitudes towards all sorts of things. I lived in an age where women were regularly beaten by men, their husbands. And there was no possibility of any public recourse. It was, that's the family. And the father does what the father does. I lived in an era where homosexuality was legally defined as a disease. I lived in an era in which children were regularly physically abused. There was no legal recourse. Now, are you going to tell me, when I say an era, I am saying across the board. There was no dissent on these points of view, the ones I just enunciated. As Mill says, it's not just individuals who are often wrong. He says it's often entire epochs, entire eras that are wrong. It's not just individuals. So when you take recourse to the common knowledge of a community, somehow justifying the legitimacy or the veracity of a certain claim to truth, having lived through an epoch in which all of those common knowledge truths were completely overthrown, I now can see in retrospect exactly what Mill says. Namely, not just individuals, but whole eras can be wrong. We can't use that as the standard for not allowing certain opinions to be heard.
What's Mill say about children and savages?
I'm not talking about now Mill's political opinions, many of which I think are wrong. He was also a victim of his times. We are all victims of our times. But acknowledging that has to then be followed by the acknowledgement that not only you as an individual might be wrong, but your whole epoch or era might be also wrong, which is all the more reason why you have to listen to dissent, even if it's the dissent of a single individual. Now, let me just complete the thought and then I'll get to you. As Mill said, the only way you can know truth is if you let others express their opinion. And so he says, even if you know the truth, even if what you believe is true, even if what you believe is true, you still don't know the truth. Even if what you believe is true, I believe 2 is the square root of 4. And it's true. But I don't know the truth about the square root of 4. And the same way, even if it turns out that Tony is right, in fact, I'll acknowledge it. He is right. Nazi Holocaust did happen. Women don't like to be beaten or raped in any culture. Race is not, intelligence is not racially hereditary. I'll acknowledge it. Oh, wait, I will acknowledge it. I'll acknowledge it for argument's sake. I'll acknowledge it. But I'll still say you don't know the truth about any of those 3 questions. You don't know the truth because you didn't hear the other side. And you can't know the truth unless you hear the other side. You're like the king who goes like this. Because you like your answers. You like your answers. You are a politically correct person who likes your answers. And your answers may be true, but you don't know the truth. You don't know the truth. So, Mill says, okay, let me just read a quote and then we're going to do it. true opinion abides. Just a quote, because he says it with much greater eloquence. Okay. He says, assuming that the true opinion abides in the mind. Let's assume. Tony is right. Those three professors are full or are replete with feces. Let's assume Tony is right and they're wrong. Assuming that the true opinion abides in the mind, it still abides as a prejudice. It's what Tony wants to believe. It's a prejudice of belief independent of and proof against argument. You can't convince him otherwise because he won't let the other side speak. It's a prejudice. This is not the way in which truth ought to be held by a rational being.
You're not listening to the other side.
Okay, this is not knowing the truth, Tony. Truth not held is but one, let's say it, it's one superstition the more, accidentally clinging to the words which enunciate a truth. When I know what it is, my hand accidentally clung to the correct answer. But the way I know it is not by truth. It's just a superstition. I said, God help me. That's all it is. Because that's all it is with him. It's a prejudice. It's a superstition because he won't hear the other side.
All right, listen to the other side. There was a contemporaneous view about how you, almost contemporaneous view about how you establish the truth, and Marx had it, and it's the second piece of the view of that. It's very short. He said the question of whether objective truth can be attributed to human thinking is not a question of theory, but it is a practical question. Men must prove the truth, the reality and power of the dissightedness of his thinking in practice. The dispute over the reality or not reality of thinking that is isolated from practice is a purely scholastic question.
Well, actually,
so you must be able to do it in practice. It's not just that you get it from previous people who have other ideas, but you must be able to show in practice that your truth is the truth. And that is completely opposite of what John Stuart...
No, I don't think so at all, because as Mill will say in the subsequent chapters on conduct, not on speech, on conduct, he's going to say that the only way you can know whether a theory has any validity is by what he calls experiments in living. You have to test them in practice. He says exactly the same thing. He doesn't use the kind of Germanic language, this-sidedness, and the sort of stuff which, you know, that's Marx's philosophical tradition and probably sounds just fine in German. It sounds a little alien to an English audience. I believe that. I'm not afraid to say it anymore. You know, Rosa Luxemburg, when she read Das Kapital, she said she didn't particularly like the Rococo style of chapter 1. And I found chapter 1 impenetrable, as most of you know. That's the very tough chapter, but that's the German Rococo style. Marx says it on fancy language, but I think the essence is not different. He says, yes, you can't prove any theory, the validity of any theory, until you test it in practice. And that's why he said you have to have a variety of experiments in living. Let people test different ways of living and see which is the best and which is the worst. So there's not really a difference there. But the difference comes in whether you're going to put limits on these experiments in conduct in the same way as are you going to put limits on what you hear. Now, everyone recognizes in any experiments in conduct, there has to be limits put. Do we allow an experiment with incest? No, we don't. Society puts a limit there. It says it does it for scientific and moral reasons. So we always put limits on experiments in conduct, though also the limits have completely changed over time.
You do also speak in
1960s, 50s, gay marriage, gay adoption. I mean, these ideas, I mean, it's very hard for the younger people to understand. They were not even, you couldn't mentally conceive them. It was not mentally conceivable. And times have changed. So even the limits on conduct have changed drastically. But still, everyone acknowledges when it comes to conduct, there will be limits. We will draw them differently, and we may be wrong. Entire epochs can be wrong. But we still recognize the necessity. But it's not when it comes to speech. Yes?
So, just for clarity, related to the previous question, then there's every right for someone who's a complete liar to go around talking lies if they've got sufficient support. And they don't do that for the rest of their life.
Okay, can I ask your name?
Can I take a food?
Wait, I'm going to just ask your name, do you mind?
Habib.
Habib. You see, the problem is, it's again the premise, Habib. You assume they're complete liars because you assume that what you think is true is the truth. People used to tell me for my entire adult life that everything I was saying about the Palestinians, I was a complete liar.
You can't prove something, you're a liar.
Excuse me?
You can prove something.
Yeah, but you see now, Tony, Habib, you're ending up contradicting yourself. Because now you're saying, Habib, they have to prove, right? But how can they prove if you don't let them speak? The moment you say they have to prove, then you have to let them speak.